Good evening. I'm Nathan Hill, the Sam Lam Professor in Chinese Studies and Director of the Trinity Centre for Asian Studies here at Trinity College Dublin. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar, A Good Year to Found a Republic, the Year of the Ox, 1949, which will feature short talks by 3 of our centre's members. This event is held as part of Dublin Chinese Lunar New Year, and I would like to thank Muireann O'Sullivan for her help in organizing it. I particularly would like to welcome students from the Pharos University in Alexandria, some of whom I understand are in the audience. Trinity has recently signed a collaborative agreement with the Pharos University, and we look forward to strengthening this relationship in the coming years. The Trinity Centre for Asian Studies was founded in 2015 and serves as the Center for Asia-related research and teaching across the university. We are particularly strong in the research areas of modern Chinese history, the study of China's minority ethnicities, and the development of the Chinese language. Our flagship program is the MPhil in Chinese Studies. This intensive taught master's degree offers a unique opportunity to engage deeply and critically with China today and provides a solid and rigorous grounding for various career aspirations. I hope you will enjoy tonight's program. Please consider joining our mailing list and following us on social media. I have put the details into the chat section. Please be aware that tonight's event is being recorded. If you have questions, please, in the course of the presentations that are made by tonight's speakers, please put them in the Q&A section, which is different than the chat section. And I will collect these and address some of them to our speakers at the end of this evening's event. Now, with no further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Isabella Jackson, who will deliver the talk, The Chinese People Have Stood Up, Anti-Imperialism and the Founding of the People's Republic.
Happy New Year, 新年快乐. Today is the New Year's Eve of the Lunar New Year, and tomorrow we will begin the Year of the Ox. This evening we're looking back at another Year of the Ox, 1949, when both China and Ireland established new republics. We will introduce some key aspects of the new People's Republic of China at its inception. Now we're here in Dublin in Ireland, although I know we're joined by people in other places, and China and Ireland both established their republics in 1949. China, like Ireland, had suffered from a history of foreign imperialism, including British imperialism. And like Ireland, China had had a fresh start already in the 20th century with the overthrowing of the last imperial dynasty, the Qing, and the founding of the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China in 1912. But that republic had disappointed. There were many differences, of course, between Ireland and China, notably that the founding of the Republic in Ireland meant the recognition of what had de facto been true for years, whereas the Chinese Communist victory of 1949 meant the overthrowing of an old government and system and establishing an entirely new one. There was, however, continuity in China too. Some areas had been under communist rule since as early as the 1930s. Today, I will introduce the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, focusing on how the communists defined their victory as liberation from foreign and domestic oppression, and how that helped them win popular support. Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic on the 1st of October 1949, standing in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. It is widely believed that he said as part of that speech that the Chinese people have stood up. But he actually said it at an internal party meeting a couple of weeks earlier. This doesn't matter. The sentiment chimed with people's expectations. So let's look at what he said at that meeting. The Chinese people, comprising 1/4 of humanity, have now stood up. The Chinese have always been a great, courageous, and industrious nation. It is only in modern times that they have fallen behind. And that was due entirely to oppression and exploitation by foreign imperialism and domestic reactionary governments. For over a century, our forefathers never stopped waging unyielding struggles against domestic and foreign oppressors. We have defeated both domestic and foreign oppressors, and now we are proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic of China. Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up. Mao's speech in Beijing a couple of weeks later was actually less stirring. Half the speech was given over to listing all the members of the new People's Governing Council. He did, however, make this point at the beginning. The people throughout China have been plunged into bitter suffering since the Chiang Kai-shek government betrayed the fatherland, colluded with imperialists, and launched the counter-revolutionary war. So again, Mao is emphasizing the failure of the previous regime to protect China from foreign invasion. He went on, fortunately, our People's Liberation Army, backed by the whole nation, has been fighting heroically and selflessly to defend the territorial sovereignty of our homeland, to protect the people's lives and property, to relieve the people of their sufferings, and to struggle for their rights. Now the People's War of Liberation has been basically won, and the majority of the people have been liberated. The propaganda here is, but the speech is worth taking seriously because it shows how the communists were selling their victory to the nation. In both Mao's private speech and his public declaration, the same theme of domestic and foreign oppressors resonates. The communists were liberating the people against exploitative landlords, capitalists, and foreign imperialists. The new China would have no more extortionate rents, no more daily humiliations by foreigners like a customer kicking a rickshaw puller, no more foreign and Chinese capitalists paying miserly wages to factory workers operating in miserable conditions, and no more foreign armies on Chinese soil. Liberation became the shorthand for the communist victory of 1949. As the communists went about consolidating their newly claimed territory, both before and after 1949, people throughout the country were encouraged to recall the humiliation of life in old China before liberation. Men and women would recount at so-called speak bitterness meetings how hard life had been, emphasizing exploitation and oppression at the hands of landlords, capitalists, and foreign imperialists. At one meeting, 13 people described how they had lived on the brink of starvation with no land or draft animals before the communists redistributed land. The communist program of land reform, pursued in the 40s and 50s, distributed land equally to all, in theory, landlord, rich peasant, and poor peasant alike, although in reality it wasn't necessarily this equitable. The aim of the Speak Bitterness meetings was to instill class consciousness in people who did not have much ideological understanding of Marxism. As people listened to speakers talking about experiences like their own, they developed sympathy for them and a sense of solidarity. The communists particularly liked women and the elderly to speak at these meetings on the basis that they would evoke more sympathy. They therefore encouraged women to recount their experiences of rape at the hands of Japanese soldiers. Female textile factory workers in Shanghai told of the cruelty of their old British bosses. An elderly couple told a large crowd in Anhui province how their landlord had beaten their son to death over a debt and left them destitute. The outraged crowd called out, "Down with the evil tyrant landlord." Often these meetings ended in violence against the former oppressors, and that was not accidental. Communist methods made ordinary people feel empowered in claiming control over their own lives from those who had exploited them. This, along with the meaningful land reform, helped persuade China's peasants, around 90% of the population, that their interests would be better served by the communists than their predecessors. Reinforcing its anti-imperialist credentials helped the Communist Party lay claim to a long history of popular protest against the government's failure to protect the nation from foreign aggression. From 1915 onwards, protest movements, often led by students, erupted regularly in major cities, especially Beijing and Shanghai. So here we have on the left a crowd gathering to protest the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and that became the May 4th movement. And on the right, there's a monument to the protest movement that followed a massacre by British-managed police force in Shanghai of peaceful protesters, and that then became a major anti-imperialist movement. the largest general strike in Shanghai's history. And crucially, the Communist Party, which had only recently been founded, was a key mover in that strike, helping the workers and students and merchants all coordinate. So the communists had a more consistent record as anti-imperialists than their nationalist opponents, who had vacillated between opposition to foreign imperialism and pragmatic accommodation of it. Most notably, Chiang Kai-shek tried to delay war with Japan for as long as possible, despite Japan seizing Manchuria, on the map shown in red as Manchukuo, in 1931, because Chiang Kai-shek knew his forces needed to be strengthened first. He also wanted to eliminate the internal communist threat before taking on an external enemy. Only being kidnapped by two of his own generals in December 1936 persuaded Chiang to pause his attack on the communists and focus all his forces on trying to defend China against Japan. Chiang Kai-shek then worked closely with the USA, Britain, and other allied powers in the war, but these were the same countries that had exploited China for a century. So here's a picture of him at the Cairo conference during the war, planning the reconstruction post-war. During the war, Chiang Kai-shek negotiated with Britain and the US to abandon their imperial privileges in China, especially the extraterritorial right to apply their own laws to their nationals in China, making foreigners exempt from Chinese law. But after the war, many foreigners carried on behaving as if nothing had changed. It was only the arrival of the communists that made most of them flee. The communists, therefore, were able to claim to have freed China from foreign imperialism. So thanks to their genuine or perceived liberation of the people from oppression by landlords, communists, and imperialists, the communists were genuinely popular when the People's Republic was founded in 1949. That year now defines China's liberation from so-called semi-feudalism, with its exploitative landlords, and from the century of national humiliation. That humiliation began with the Opium War, when Britain went to war with China to demand open access to its markets to sell illegal drugs. The way the communists claim credit for liberating the Chinese people from humiliation and oppression remains the cornerstone of their popular appeal today. And I'll hand over now to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for this interesting talk. And now our next speaker will be Dr. Peter Hamilton, and his talk is A Strong Economy for a Strong Nation, Early State Capitalism in the People's Republic.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and to Isabella for that great previous talk. So my talk tonight is about a strong economy for a strong nation, early state capitalism in the People's Republic. Few of us have ever lived under Marxist socialism, let alone a communist revolution. And as a result, I think from our 21st century perspectives, most of us have pretty vague ideas of how such a revolution works or how a socialist economy actually functions. I, at least for one, originally imagined, well, the communists took over and then everything was communist. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. And particularly when it comes to economics, the laws of gravity, mathematics, and supply and demand still apply. So what I want to highlight today is that despite coming to power through a violent revolution in October 1949, Mao and the Chinese Communist Party's early economic policies were actually quite pragmatic, not driven by ideological doctrine or simply declaring everything to be nationalized. And instead, after taking over China's major cities, the new PRC's initial goal was to reform and strengthen a state capitalist economy that could stabilize a very chaotic situation and deliver tangible results. And so to show you that this evening, I'll highlight the distinctions the new regime made here between two different types of capitalists, their early financial reforms and the introduction of the PRC's currency, and some of the one example in particular of pragmatic officials who were in charge at this time. And then I'll conclude by briefly highlighting how the Korean War changed this situation. So as the tide began to turn in China's civil war and communist forces, the People's Liberation Army, began pushing south from Manchuria, it was obvious that the new government would still have to deal with the same economic problems as their defeated rivals, the nationalists or Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, as Isabella mentioned. And these included rampant inflation, mass speculation and hoarding, and widespread shortages of basic goods like fuel, food, clothing. And so for the time being, those very tangible problems took precedence over anything socialist, particularly in the cities. As Isabella mentioned, in the countryside, the Chinese Communist Party had a lot of previous experience and thus a coherent plan about how to deliver tangible results to ordinary people. And that included, as she mentioned, speaking bitterness sessions, very often violence, substantial violence, and the redistribution of land, as well as things like the redistribution of plow animals and tools and things like that. And so that had developed through a long set of years in the countryside. That was their expertise. Cities were completely different. Before 1949, the communists had never ruled a large city at all. As a result, the first cities that the PLA takes, Beijing, which at the time was still called Beiping, because it was not the capital at that moment, and Tianjin on the coast in early January 1949, when they took these over, the day-to-day administration of a large and complex metropolis was a difficult and thorny question for them. How were businesses to operate? What was permissible? What was not permissible? Many urban workers rose up and demanded immediate pay raises, the punishment of big industrialists and bankers, and the immediate collectivization of ownership of big enterprises. But that's a lot easier said than done. If the owners were removed and the factory collectivized, then who would make all the complex decisions about factories' purchases of raw materials? Who would coordinate sales and deliveries or manage financial accounts? Very few workers or CCP officials had the skills to manage a large-scale urban industrial enterprise. And if wages were raised and the factory was not profitable anymore, who was going to pay to make up that difference? What was to prevent owners and managers from fleeing the country? And so with all of this, an open question and the economy very much in chaos, the CCP the Communist Party did not yet use force against urban elites by and large, the same way that it did against landlords. It also generally did not seize companies or force them into liquidation. Instead, Mao and the party first tried to persuade capitalists to stay and work with them by creating a pretty imaginary distinction between the so-called comprador bureaucratic capitalists who would be stigmatized as exploiters and the supposedly patriotic national capitalists who would be praised and honored and find a new place in the new society. And so this label was pretty arbitrary and simply an incentive for capitalists to be cooperative and to encourage them not to flee and instead to lend their expertise to the new country, the new state. As Zhou Enlai informed one worried capitalist, who is a national capitalist? Whoever we decide. In essence, though, the CCP pursued much more moderate policies toward the cities and courted capitalists to stay and work with them. In part, the party simply realized that actually ruling China is very different than theorizing about it. Another top official, Liu Shaoqi, discussed this in what became to be called the Tianjin talks, in which he explained to the public that parts of the capitalist system needed to remain in place. For example, he declared that wages and working hours would only be changed if they were proven to be truly exploitative. He also dismissed workers' claims that they could run the factories themselves, arguing that no cooperatives were actually all that well run. In turn, however, Liu Shaoqi declared businesses needed to work with the party and gradually introduce party work methods, study Mao Zedong thought, and coordinate their production with state-set goals, which are not such unreasonable demands. Finance is another area where the early PRC was pretty pragmatic. Again, a top reason that the nationalist government had lost the support of the urban middle class was runaway inflation and other very poor economic decisions. Determined to bring those problems under control, the new PRC acted more cautiously. Private banks were allowed to continue for several years, while the new renminbi, or people's currency, was introduced with expertise and care. The amount of currency in circulation was tightly restricted, and banks were forbidden to loan amongst each other, only to customers and to the government. They were then systematically stress tested, and most were required to improve their capital reserve ratios and deposit reserves with the New People's Bank of China. And the reality is that within a very short period of time, the financial chaos that had bedeviled China for years was brought under control. The most important city economically in the whole country was Shanghai, and Shanghai was by far the greatest generator of tax revenue, and thus managing it well was really essential for the new regime. As a result, when the PLA entered Shanghai in May 1949, an elite economic planning team arrived with the troops. And one leader of this economic planning team was named Gu Jun, a trained accountant who had worked for various foreign and Chinese companies in Shanghai in the 1930s. But he had also secretly joined the Communist Party in 1935. Upon his return to the city, Gu Jun was appointed the head of Shanghai's tax bureau and a member of the National Finance Ministry, which gave him kind of interlocking positions to overhaul the financial structure of Shanghai and extract revenue for the new state. Gu Jun dispatched representatives to all the city's governing departments and instructed that all staff should be kept in order to ensure continuity. He also issued a public proclamation instructing Shanghai's residents to continue following the old laws and to keep paying the old taxes. He used his networks among the city's bourgeoisie to convince them that the new government was sincere and responsible, convincing them to stay. And then he began to hire over 1,000 auditors and accountants, a kind of accounting cadres, which is something probably many of us haven't thought about before, who conducted a comprehensive tax survey of the city of Shanghai, something that had never been done before. And the result is that rather than freezing or seizing properties through tax, the new People's Government of Shanghai was able to more moderately and progressively alter the tax structure, increasing taxes on big conglomerates and foreign companies, actually reducing taxes on small and medium companies. And by March 1951, Shanghai's tax receipts had swollen to 11 times their level of the previous year. All these pragmatic policies of economic strengthening then played a key role when China joined the Korean War in October 1915. But the war then is also the turning point that accelerates the path towards socialism earlier than planned. As in so many wartime contexts and for many different countries, the war effort accelerated the need for Beijing to intervene in the economy and thus accelerated the path towards socialism. As a result, under the Resist America, Aid Korea campaign, instead the new economic goal became full-out maximizing production of every factory, mine, and other major enterprise. And as the government took a greater hand in managing this production and distribution, it also pressured more and more companies to finance the war effort by higher taxes and voluntarily purchasing people's victory bonds. And it's this enormous fundraising that begins to drive more and more companies either into actual bankruptcy or to realize that their financial position as a private firm was untenable when they were making such large donations to the people's government. And as a result, by summer 1952, about 18 months into the war, virtually every major private industrial firm in the PRC had either gone bankrupt, begun the proceedings of bankruptcy, or formally requested the public government to take them over and relieve them of their financial headaches, while all banks were nationalized in December 1952. And so what I want you guys to take away from this is that throughout 1949 and 1950, the new communist government pursued pretty pragmatic policies, what we could call state capitalism. It did not wipe out private industry in one fell swoop or take everything over in one fell swoop. And that instead it's the Korean War that, like many war contexts, dramatically accelerates the timeline of state intervention and the acceleration of a timeline, you might call it, towards socialism.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Now we will move on to our third and final presentation. But just a reminder that after that, there will be a question period. So everyone feel free to start putting your questions for any speaker into the Q&A section when you feel so moved. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ning Jiang, who will give the talk, New China, New Chinese Language, Standardization and Simplifying Chinese in the New People's Republic.
Hello, everyone. Let's start from the map of China. So this is the map of China. It's like a rooster. Unfortunately, it's not an ox. So the heart here is the capital of China, Beijing. And when we see the ethno-linguistic groups of China, you will find not all people living in China speaking Chinese. For example, the north part, cohort may speak Mongolian, and a little bit part from the east north will speak Korean. And for the south part, some of them may speak some languages belongs to the Burmese language. However, for those people who speaking Chinese language in the Chinese land, can they understand each other? I should say no, because as you can see this map, there are 7 dialects of Mandarin in the China, and most of them, I should say, vary from each other a lot. For example, if I would like to say "I like you" in Chinese in different dialects, probably if I use Chinese Mandarin, which is in the north part, which is the dialect in the north part, they will say "很喜欢你." But if I say in Wu dialect, it will be "我呼吸你." So you may can hear the languages, and if there are no standard language in China, people cannot understand each other. This is why a standardized language probably is necessary in the new people's for Chinese people. So today I would like to introduce the China and Chinese and why the standard Chinese language is necessary, and then try to introduce how Chinese people make an effort to standardize Chinese language and establishing the standard Chinese education, and finally find a corresponding Chinese writing systems with this language system. I should say try to standardize Chinese language is not it is not a new attempt of the People's Republic China. At that moment, they call the standardized Chinese as 雅言, 官话, or 国语. 雅言 literally means elegant language, 官话 official language, 国语 national language. So you can feel from the name, literally from the names, those standardized language actually is established by the government and used especially for the officers of the government. So in other words, the ordinary people, can they still touch that? I should say very rare. They rarely can touch that from the standard language, and most of them still cannot understand each other. So then we go to the late Qing Dynasty and the Republic China. I believe you can see the chaotic conditions of the China at that moment from Isabella and Peter's slides. So a lot of scholars try to propose we have to have a standardized language for the ordinary people with the purpose of promoting education, unifying Chinese people, and finally save the country from the chaotic wars. This starts from try to set a standard Chinese language grammatically, and this is and they notice there are always proposals from Yuan and Ming and the Qing Dynasty, again from the 13th century. At that moment, scholars noticed the written form is totally different from the colloquialism Chinese language. In other words, so for the ordinary peoples, the novels they listened and they read is written in the vernacular Chinese. However, for the official Chinese government at that moment, they're still using the most classic Chinese, which is generated and keep nearly the same from the 2000 years ago. And as the representative example is the imperial examination. So people have to learn the classic Chinese to pass this examination to become the officers. So when noticing that, scholars started to require start a literacy revolution since the Republic of China. They believe we have to use the vernacular Chinese as a standardized Chinese language for the writing in the literacy Chinese to writing in the vernacular. And with the push of the scholars in the Republic of China, the government of the Republic of China started 国语运动, national language movements. Successfully in the nationwide. With the perspective of the Chinese pronunciation, there are a huge debate and early proposals since the late Qing dynasty. Again, as we can see, there are 7 dialects. So scholars have a huge debate of choosing what kind of the pronunciation of each of dialect to set as a foundation of the standardized Chinese pronunciation. And the next main topic is choosing a proper phonetic system for the Chinese characters. But the huge debate is for the Chinese characters. Here are several proposals. One is to abandon Chinese totally and replace with the Esperanto. Second one is to keep the Chinese language, but abandon the Chinese characters and make the Chinese characters romanization. In other words, writing Chinese language in the English alphabet. And the third proposal about the Chinese characters is to keep the Chinese language, but simplify Chinese characters. So after the 1949, the government of the People's Republic of China starts to continue this work and generate a lot of meetings and debates from the 1950. Finally, in the 1955, they established Tonghua as the standard form of the modern Chinese. As you can see here, it is with the Beijing phonological system as its form of the pronunciation, and the northern dialects as its base dialect, and looking to the modern works in vernacular literacy language for its grammatical norms. So we can see the result of the debate. In terms of the standardized Chinese language grammatically, they choose the modern works. They support the literacy revolution requirements and choose the vernacular literacy language as its standardized form. And for the pronunciation part, the Beijing dialect, the Chinese Northern dialect, finally wins and becomes the foundation of the norm of the Chinese pronunciation. And in the written form, they generated the simplified Chinese characters based on the traditional characters. I don't think we have enough time to go through all the several basic rules, but probably as you can see here as an example, this is the characters. This is the left one is the traditional character of chicken. The right one is the simplified Chinese character of chicken. So you can see like the changing the complex parts with the easiest parts, and to make the Chinese characters much more easier to learn and to write. Finally, in order to promote the Chinese writing system and let all the students understand all the standard pronunciation, they finally choose the Chinese. They finally choose the pinyin system, which is based on the English alphabet, to show the Chinese phonetic system. As you can see here, it is standardized syllable to represent the Chinese characters. So one syllable normally equals to one Chinese characters. A syllable contains the initial in the left part, a final in the right part, and the tones above the vowels. So standardized Mandarin contributing a lot to the communication and education in China. At this moment, the latest statistic shows nearly all Chinese, around 80% of the Chinese speakers, of the peoples living in China, can communicate fluently in Mandarin. But again, there are some complaints, like the language conditions in Ireland. So promoting a standardized general used language may harm the ethnic minorities' languages, or may threaten the Chinese dialects. And again, simplified Chinese characters also got a lot of criticized, like this GIF here, like this picture here, and this is the love. This is the characters, means love. So simplified Chinese character removed heart from this love. So a lot of people say there are no hearts in Chinese love. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and happy Chinese New Year. 新年快乐.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ning, for this presentation. And now the floor is open for questions. And while I wait for members of the audience to put some questions in the chat, I have some questions myself. So that's a nice opportunity for me. And I'll start with Isabella. I wonder, particularly with Peter's presentation in mind about economic management during this period of transition, can you just say something about kind of concretely, like when you go into a village and redistribute land, you know, who do you take land away from and who do you give it to? Yeah.
Right, so the communists had gone through various experiments with land reform in the areas they have controlled on and off since the 30s. So they began with a very radical kind of land reform where peasants were encouraged to violently seize land from their landlords. And the idea was that if you farmed the land, it was by right. Then during the Sino-Japanese War, they went to the other extreme and were very pragmatic, realizing that they just needed stability socially, but also economically. So there was no redistribution of land, just there was a real check put on rents so that people weren't being extorted by landlords. And so there's a bit of a difference between what the rhetoric was and what the instructions were and what actually happened. And there's a lot of regional variation. But from the 40s, the idea is the land that is farmed in a village would be divided up by all of the households in that village equally. So regardless of if you're a landlord or a rich peasant or a poor peasant, you would end up with the same amount of land. Now, obviously, some villages would have more land per capita than in others. So it's not like everyone was getting the amount of land China, and it would, you know, the amount of land needed to raise rice would be different compared to if you were growing wheat in the north or whatever the local agricultural practice was. the trouble was, although in theory they weren't encouraging violence, they actually were, in the sense that they're deliberately holding these struggle sessions and speak bitterness sessions, which are encouraging people to feel angry with their landlords and then act upon it. And so it's not as lacking in violence as they kind of claimed, but it certainly it achieved the basic aim of land to the tillers. The people who were doing the work on the land did then get kind of possession, in a sense, of that land, and that's a very meaningful gain for you if you've been working the land all your life and living in poverty. So it was a very popular policy.
If I can just press you a little further, so I've only recently moved to Trinity and was previously living in England, and in England we still have landlords, and the way a typical village works is you have the sort of manor house at one end of the village, and that's where the lord lives, and then all of the peasants kind of work a certain amount of land, kind of that's technically owned by the landlord, but they exercise usufruct rights over it, and then they have the demes, which they work kind of on behalf of the landlord. So if I imagine myself, wanting to liberate an English village, then I would come in with some surveyors and say, like, okay, well, this is how much each peasant's current parcel is, and this is how much the demes is, and now this is a kind of logical way to redivide this land in roughly equal parcels, and now, once the surveying work is done, I sort of circulate some new map or something and say, okay, guys, this is how it works now. Is that, what I should imagine? Okay.
This is basically going back to the difference between, intention and what goes on the ground. So in theory, yes, cadres go in and there's careful assessments made, and they work out not, who's the landlord, as you say, who's been kind of doing the actual work. There isn't an effort, how in Marxist ideology, there's two stages: there's socialism and there's communism. And socialism would have you just distribute according to the work that people are doing, and then full communism is when you're distributing according to need. So there's not even an attempt at this stage to do it according to need. So even if you're frail and unable to work, you would still get land or the benefit of the land. This stage is just aiming at giving it to the people who are doing the work. But in reality, often it's more of a free fall where, if you're the big strong peasant and you go and kill the landlord, then you get more land out of it. But there's a real variation in different areas. It depends how good party discipline is in that area. It depends how exploitative the landlord was. There's some landlords where there's a residual loyalty to them, and then there's other ones where they really were horrific in the way they treated the local people. And so, there isn't a simple answer to that question. I'm afraid there's a lot of variation.
Okay, so and then I so just to explain that Isabella is the person who may have to leave first, so that's why I'm grilling her. So just one last thing, which actually Peter knows has already been on my mind, which is since you mentioned kind of in the theory of Marxist ideology. Well, in Marx's actual works, in his writings, he presented the means of production relationship in China as being something called the Asiatic mode of production, and that they weren't feudal, so they wouldn't have had landlords.
Right.
And I don't know the details, but my understanding is they didn't have landlords in the sense of a legal subordination where you have the noblemen and the peasants, and like for instance in the UK, I think until the 30s, if you committed a crime as a nobleman, you were tried your jury only had other noblemen in it because they're your peers, not normal people, right? And so can you just say a little bit about kind of the mapping of Marx's categories, whether in classical Marxism or Maoism, onto the actual on-the-ground reality right as they were implementing these things in the 40s?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Nathan. It is a desire, as you were suggesting at the end there, to shoehorn China into a Marxist ideology, which he designed with Western European nations in mind. So it isn't a neat fit. Mao determined that China had been feudal up until the Opium War and then became semi-feudal. It's totally unclear to me what foreign imperialism would have had to do with that process when the foreign imperialists had little to do with the countryside and next to nothing to do with the relationship between landlords and peasants. But this was necessary for him to be showing a kind of progression where then you can have a communist party come and be the vanguard and lead people into revolution. So he drew obviously also on Lenin, which had, Lenin's ideology had adapted Marxism to make it suitable for a peasant-rich society in Russia. But even then they had a far greater proletariat than China. So Mao's big innovation was turning Marxism into a peasant revolution ideology. Specifically in terms of, I don't know enough about whether Marx's idea of China as an Asiatic kind of economy would be accurate. It doesn't sound great. We know he didn't go to China. It sounds like it smacks of kind of 19th century European chauvinism. So I doubt it's a particularly helpful way of understanding how rural relations worked either. We'd be better off kind of looking at what happened on the ground, which was, as you said, it's not the same as kind of English feudalism. It's certainly not the same as Russian kind of serf existence either. It's its own thing, which is, as I've indicated, often very exploitative, but not necessarily on the same basis as you were suggesting. But there is still a kind of a sense of inferiority and superiority, the idea that landlords would feel they were kind of closer to the emperor, they were more educated, they were better than the peasants who would be doing the work on the land. So there is still, even though it's different from European feudalism, there's still that sense of hierarchy, I would suggest.
Yeah, it wasn't a particularly socially mobile society, yeah.
Right, yeah, I don't know if people, if you wanted to come in on this, you work obviously more on other aspects of the economy, but you're more of an economic historian than I am, so.
If anyone in the audience wants to learn more about this, the book I always recommend that I think it has its problems, but is very accessible and engaging is William Hinton's Fan Shen. Hinton was an American, a kind of leftist American embedded with a United Nations agency, I believe, in North China after doing post-war reconstruction after World War II. And so he very carefully observes this process in Longbow Village, as he calls it in English. And it's an absolutely gripping account because he really gets into the weeds about how these families relate to each other and everything else that's going on in terms of old feuds and divorces and, there's even a very funny, because they not only redistribute land, but they also eventually redistribute all of the landlord's personal possessions. And so there's a very humorous scene where, kind of everyone wants their thing from the auction of the landlord's stuff and kind of fighting over, well, do you want his bedspread or do you want his coat, and what's more useful and things like that. But so it's a very, very personal, firsthand account in English of this.
Okay, and now we have a question from the audience, which I direct at Ning. Prior to 1949, could Cantonese and Mandarin speakers both understand the same written language?
I should say Chinese written language is starting from around 2,000 years ago, and again. There are standardized Chinese writing systems in China since very early, like Zhou Dynasty 2,000 years ago. So both if both of them, the Cantonese speakers and the Mandarin speakers, if they all learned the standardized Chinese writing, they can communicate by writing. But however, like from the statistic or from the historical background, before the 1949, the people who can write and who can even literally who can write, the percentage of this population is very low. The percentage of the well-educated person is very low. So that's why the scholars of the late Qing dynasty and the people and the Republic of China think simplified Chinese character is really, really necessary, because all of them think traditional Chinese characters are so hard to write, and which is the main barrier to prevent the Chinese people to being educated, and finally make the country conquers a lot of civil wars, and in terms of a lot of wars from against with other countries. And so literally yes, but practically probably no.
Okay, then we have another question about Chinese dialects, and I don't know whether you'll be able to answer it or not, but here it is. Is the Shanghai dialect closer to Jiangsu or to Jijiang?
It is another complicated question. There are a lot of small dialect areas in Jiangsu and Zhejiang. For example, in Jiangsu, the parts near Shanghai speak Wu dialect, but phonetically, there are still tiny differences. But in the northern parts and to the inner China, they are not actually speaking Wu dialect. They are speaking Chinese, an aspect of the Chinese dialect, which is called Mandarin dialect, Jianghuai Mandarin dialect, which is as a representative of Nanjing dialect. So part of the areas of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, they are speaking Wu dialect, but not all of them. And if I would like to discuss the dialects in Jiangsu and Zhejiang dialects, I think I have to take 1 hour. So I recommend you to read a book about Chinese phonology, which has a very good explanation of the Chinese dialects.
Well, we're going to still keep you busy here for a moment, which is so the main reason in your presentation for the simplification of Chinese was to improve literacy levels. So now that literacy has improved, isn't it time to go back to the traditional characters? What do you think?
Should we go back to traditional characters?
Yeah, because now people can read the simplified characters, so there's no literacy problem. So then we might as well then go back to the traditional characters.
First of all, I cannot decide that.
Okay. Well, then okay, that's the answer. Then Nina is not going to decide.
Secondly, I think learning some traditional characters based on the simplified Chinese characters is really, really helpful and beneficial because most of the Chinese written works are written in the traditional characters. So definitely we have to learn some traditional characters, not only just to understand our culture, history, but also we can understand the culture behind the Chinese characters.
I mean, I permit myself to make the remark as well that just in case people don't know, the PRC uses simplified characters, but of course Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore and people who speak Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia and whatnot, they stuck with the traditional characters. So maybe if the PRC did return to Chinese traditional characters, it would help with building national unity and integration.
Yes. By the way, Singapore and Malaysia is using simplified Chinese characters.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, Hong Kong and Taiwan are still using. Let me just see if there are more questions here. We have someone in the chat who actually met Bill Hinton, which is pretty neat. But let me check the time. Okay, just a couple minutes left, and I think that we have to give Peter his chance in the sun. So here it comes. So if I can paraphrase your story, the CCP sort of underplayed its collectivizing intentions early on, softly, but then that was escalated in the Korean War. Well, if I don't know, if I'm tempted to say, wait, that wasn't necessarily more state intervention in the economy was just indicative of a wartime economy. The same thing happened in England. The same thing happened in the U.S. The sort of Adam Smith ideal was kind of largely put on hold, and largely ideologically was put on hold, where you had this very sort of, big firms are great. So to what extent is the question of, and I mean historically at that time, to what extent is the question of the role of the government in planning the economy during wartime related to the kind of left-right issue at all, right?
War in so many contexts, no matter what the kind of economy or its aspirations, leads to more state intervention in the economy. And that part of what happens here is that, yes, there is a certain kind of, we should just accelerate the plan at this point, and kind of we had somewhat underplayed the extent that, that we were going to pursue socialism, and we'll just speed it up now because now at this point it's might as well. But some of it also maps onto some other things that I didn't mention in terms of things like the 3 and 5 Antis campaign that happens as well, in which figures like Gu Zhen are purged. And so thus more pragmatic experts, who have serious expertise in, say, accounting, in this example, lose out politically in one of the first instances of these mass political campaigns that takes place during the Korean War context. And there you have both kind of pragmatic bureaucrats like Gu Zhen pushed out of the way, and a lot of these patriotic national capitalists who had stayed in China suddenly are also targeted at this time. And some flee the country at that point in 1952, 1953, and others kind of become, at least so it seems, sincere believers in socialism and learn the error of their ways through rectification.
Yeah, so it's sort of technocratic expertise becomes a political liability in a way that that's one difference from how these things played out in communist China versus
or at least the people with expertise also tended to have had politically no longer acceptable associations with capitalists and have worked for other companies and things like that now were a bad thing to have on your resume, etc. Versus that their expertise itself was not necessarily stigmatized, but the other things that had gone along to get that expertise.
So we're just up against the time, so we should end soon. But I will just make an observation that I think ties some of Peter's work to what Ning was talking about, and this partly touches on things Peter was talking about at his Faculty in Focus event a few days ago, where he was looking at the role of Hong Kong sort of elite economic actors in being foreign educated in the U.S. And it's sort of touched on in some of my own work that actually those people who were involved in the standardization of Chinese during the Republican period, like Yuan Renchao and Li Fanghui, are people who also were foreign educated and specifically U.S. educated. So the story of that Peter has told about these trans-Pacific networks in economic development were also at play in questions like language standardization.
And Yuan Chao is actually in the book.
Oh, really?
He corresponds with some of the other people that I talk about and kind of makes recommendations for people to appoint into academic positions in Hong Kong.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming, and for those of you who asked questions, thank you for your questions. And we look forward to to welcoming you at future events at the Trinity Centre for Asian Studies, and do attend to those social media particulars that were at the beginning of my chat. So with that, I wish you a good evening.
恭喜发财。